Now, two approaches that Glaude considers to Black identity, one he calls the archaeological approach, and the other he calls the pragmatist historicist approach. The archaeological approach, the key idea is discovery, right? The ability to discover what blackness is, the ability to separate reality from appearance. So to be black is to be African at root, right? This is one way of construing this. There is a basis to be discovered consisting of elements such as a common historical experience, shared vocabularies, stable frames of reference and meaning, right? And despite the disruptions of slavery to that African identity, all of these elements can be discovered, rediscovered, and embraced again. This could involve or necessitate a kind of revolution in thinking among blacks, among African Americans. It might require critiquing white supremacist ideologies and concepts. It might require annihilating false consciousness or, embedded ideas. But it promises a return to authentic self-identity. Blackness is a unique and ultimate reality, and so this approach to identity is a recovery or a rediscovery or a reconstruction of that original essence. So this archaeological approach, he says, first allows people to discover their true selves, unique black identity, a fixed, unchanging self, right, that provides stability, a fulcrum for action and language. It provides that discovery of true self. It allows one to shed false ideas and false self-images in the process. And it also provides one with a consistent and stable way of acting, right? Because if you know who you are, you know how to act. And look, Glaude is sympathetic to why people are motivated to do this. I've already sort of told you that he's not sympathetic with this approach, but he's not. In other words, he doesn't agree with this approach, but he is sympathetic for why people do it. Why they're motivated to do it. It can be really motivated in pain. It can be motivated by impoverishment, by humiliation, by desperation. And he quotes Frantz Fanon, who explained that research into authentic selves is often a strategy of passion, and this is quoting Fanon, of passionate research directed by the secret hope of discovering beyond self-contempt, resignation, and abjuration some very beautiful and splendid error whose existence rehabilitates us both in regard to ourselves and in regard to others. So this idea of discovering a beautiful and splendid error may sound very familiar, right? It's frequently a political slogan that we are going to go back to a golden age, or we are going to make America great again, as the last campaign popularized that slogan. So there are these similar impulses, but wherever these different impulses to recapture a bygone era arises, a pragmatist approach to understanding those rhetorical moves is going to have to examine each phenomenon in its own historical context, right? What was suffered, who suffered, how did they suffer, what caused it, all of these different things. So it's not necessarily an equivalence between groups that harken back to a bygone era, and certainly the harkening back for Black identity after the excruciating and enduring experience of slavery and Jim Crow is quite different than most other historical parallels in the United States, although there are others. So let's turn to his critique of this. What's wrong with the archaeological approach, right? Why is the pragmatist approach better? Well, Glaude raises a danger with the true self-discovery project, right? It's similar to one that Dewey raises in multiple writings of his on ethics, and it comes back to this problem that is generated by a monocausal or a single factor solution to complex situations. Now, in this case, it's the authentic self, however hard it might be to find. The authentic self provides a fixed and unchanging answer to all problems. Right? That's what it promises. But problems are complex, and problems are situated, right, in a time and in a place with different people, with different backgrounds, different stakes. And so making careful distinctions empirically, right, with good observations is always important. But careful distinctions can be made unnecessary by one-size-fits-all kinds of answers. And this is quoting Glaude again. He says, in the case of this kind of essentialism, one single factor, the racial self, is postulated as an explanation of the moral lives of black people. The moral complexity and uncertainty that is often a part of political decision-making in particular is reduced to a simple conflict. The moral choices of African Americans are narrowed in such a way that the actual uncertainty and conflict that's characteristic of any situation properly called moral is obscured. End quote. And what's also sacrificed, he points out, is the individual details of the people involved, right, of their individuality. So, if race isn't real in this essentialist way, why not deconstruct it? This is another way of going about the concept. Why not focus, for example, on economics and capitalism instead, right? We don't need to talk about race. We just need to talk about economic conditions, people's economic lives. Or maybe we should just focus on merit rather than race. Let's not talk about race at all. This is frequently a way that people try to deal with the political program of affirmative action in colleges and universities, for example. People argue, let's just focus on merit, forget about race. Let's be, right, race blind or color blind. Another way of dealing with this would be to consider how race can play into racism. And the idea there is that by talking about race, by naming it, by focusing on it, by using it as a term in conversation and the adjudication of conflicts, you just create more racism that way. And so colorblindness there too plays a solution. It pretends to be a solution. Now, Glaude argues that because race has and does function in the ways that we act towards one another, right? It is one of these words that we use, that we mean something by, that has some valence and some, right, cachet and some exchange value, if you will. It can't just be analyzed or deconstructed away. Again, he's concerned that there are good pragmatic reasons to keep race in the conversation. Now, race doesn't have to be considered an essentialist idea, right? Real in a metaphysical sense. Race doesn't have to be deconstructed, reduced, explained away either. Rather, race is a term that can lead us towards empirical inquiry and a possibility of a variety of interpretations depending on context, uses, and purposes. So he focuses on some of these approaches, right? The pragmatist, historicist approaches. And so that last response, the one that I was just going through, this method of rejecting the essentialist response really just is this pragmatist approach. And so to elaborate just a little bit, pragmatism looks to identity as it has consequences in action. So recall Peirce on the word hard in the physical sciences, right? Its meaning depends on how something will interact with the world. Its meaning also determines how we will test it, how we will observe it, right? And how we will use it potentially. So in this case, the term identity or blackness, right, or race requires the same kind of pragmatic assessment. And Glaude writes about this. Identities are in part the products of our actions as we struggle to resolve problematic situations, dispose of meddlesome circumstances, and surmount obstacles. Our problem-solving activity turns out to be our lives, right? That's interesting, that our problem-solving turns out to be our lives. So our self on this pragmatist historicist view is not a stable or unchanging core, right? Not the soul embedded in the body or something like that. the mind in the machine. Rather, what self is, and this is Glaude again, he says, it's an organization of habits that's relatively stable and enduring. What we have done and what we are doing, the stories we weave about these experiences, are the pragmatist view of how to construe Black identity. So, this meaning by constructed narrative approach is one that's illustrated in his piece by the Exodus story, right? This Exodus story is a way for African Americans to redescribe their circumstances in ways which used historical parallels, right, from the Bible to project a sense of righteousness and moral destiny. And he goes into some discussion about different debates about how that story could be interpreted that I won't go into now. So the question then becomes, can common interests or problems perhaps determine Black identity? Right? Later in the piece, Glaude points out that, well, often we do have common interests, and often we do have common problems, right? Or groups of people have them. And these can be identified, but this identification of common interests and problems cannot settle once and for all a fixed nature of Black identity. And he says, the goal of defining what the interests of African Americans are seems to me impossible. What matters here, again, is the force of some meddlesome circumstance or problematic, the need to move in some way to alleviate the situation, with an eye toward problem-solving activity, and not the view that there is but one conception of the good. So what's pragmatic here is the fallible but melioristic attitude that attends to problematic circumstances, that doesn't seek to define all interests or goals in advance, and that doesn't preordain methods or the specifics of a solution. Right? And this is best done, he says, when race remains a tool to address specific experiences so that ideas and actions in them can be unpacked and understood in new ways, and greater control can be brought to dealing with those problems.